A 63-year-old woman stood in her kitchen holding a letter from a dead man, not her husband who had died 4 months ago and whose coffee mug still sat beside the sink exactly where he'd left it. This letter came from her father, a man her mother swore had been buried before Eleanor's 5th birthday. He had been alive the entire time, 89 years old, when his heart finally stopped living in a cabin he'd built with his own hands in a town Eleanor had never heard of. And he had left everything to her. People told Eleanor Wynn she was handling her grief well. They said it at the funeral, at the grocery store, at the mailbox, where she stood every morning pretending to check for something important. They mistook her stillness for strength. But what they didn't know was that Eleanor hadn't cried once since George died. Not at the hospital, not at the service, not in the 4 months since alone in a house so quiet. She could hear the clock in the hallway from every room. Something inside her had locked shut, and she couldn't find the key. Before we continue, if stories like this one mean something to you, stories about family and second chances and the things we almost lose, take a moment and subscribe. You won't miss what comes next. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, tucked between a water bill and a furniture catalog addressed to George Wynn. The kind of mail that doesn't know a person is gone. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, with a return address she didn't recognize. Franklin Jessup, attorney at Law Briar Hollow, West Virginia. Eleanor stood at the counter and opened it with her thumb. George's coffee mug was to her left. A brown ring had dried inside the rim, and she hadn't washed it because washing it meant deciding where to put it. And deciding where to put it meant admitting he wasn't coming back to drink from it. The letter was one page typed on heavy paper. Dear Mrs. Wynn, I am writing to inform you that Thomas Edward Wynn passed away on February 3rd of this year at the age of 89. Mr. Wynn was a resident of Briar Hollow, West Virginia for the past 59 years. He has named you Eleanor Marie Wynn as the sole beneficiary of his estate, which includes a residential property, 40 acres of forested land, and personal effects contained therein. Eleanor read the letter twice. She set it on the counter and pressed both hands flat against the granite the way she used to steady herself when a student was having a meltdown in her classroom, and she needed to be the calmest person in the room. Thomas Edward Wynn, her father's name. A name her mother had buried so deep that Eleanor sometimes forgot it existed at all. He died before you were born, Vivian used to say. And her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who had decided a long time ago that this was the version of events she intended to carry to her grave. He was not a well man, Eleanor. There's nothing to tell. Eleanor was 4 years old the last time she saw her father. She did not remember his face. She remembered hands, rough and warm, lifting her onto something high, a countertop maybe, or a workbench. She remembered the smell of sawdust. She remembered a voice singing low and off-key, a melody she could almost hold in her mind, but never quite catch. That was all. 4 years of a father reduced to sawdust and a song. And now a lawyer in West Virginia was telling her that man had been alive for 59 more years, that he had lived in a cabin, that he had left it to her. She picked up the phone and called Vivian. Her mother lived in a care facility outside Columbus, Ohio. A clean, expensive place with handrails in every hallway, and a courtyard where the residents sat in the mornings watching birds they couldn't name. Vivian was 86. Her mind was still sharp, her tongue sharper. She answered on the third ring. Mom, I got a letter from a lawyer in West Virginia about Dad. Silence. Not the confused silence of someone who doesn't understand. The loaded silence of someone who understands exactly and is deciding how much wall to put up. Eleanor waited. Vivian's voice came through thin and controlled. Don't go to that cabin, Eleanor. There's nothing there for you. He was alive. All this time he was alive, and you told me he was dead. I told you what you needed to hear. I needed to hear the truth. You needed a life without him in it. I gave you that. You're welcome. The line went dead. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, holding the phone against her ear, listening to nothing. George's coffee mug sat on the counter. The clock ticked in the hallway. The house was so still she could feel her own heartbeat in her teeth. She set the phone down and picked up the letter again. She read the address at the bottom. Franklin Jessup, 14 Main Street, Briar Hollow, West Virginia. She looked at the date. The lawyer had sent this letter 3 weeks ago. Thomas Wynn had died 8 months before that. Her father had been dead for almost a year, and nobody had told her because nobody thought she needed to know, or because the one person who did know had spent 60 years making sure Eleanor never found out he existed. She went to the bedroom closet and pulled down the cardboard box she had been avoiding since Vivian moved into the facility. Her mother had sent it 3 years ago with a note that said, "These are yours now. I don't want them in my room." The box was sealed with packing tape that had turned yellow and brittle. Eleanor peeled it back and opened the flaps. Inside were old photographs, a marriage certificate, a handful of documents in faded folders, and at the bottom, pressed flat beneath everything else, a stack of envelopes held together with a rubber band so old it had fused to the paper. She pulled them out. 23 envelopes. Each one addressed to Eleanor Marie in care of Vivian Wynn at addresses that tracked her mother's moves across 3 states over 40 years. The handwriting was steady, unhurried, the penmanship of someone who worked with his hands and understood that precision mattered. Every single envelope had been opened. The flaps were slit, cleanly read, then pressed shut again. Some had been resealed with tape. None had ever been forwarded. None had ever reached Eleanor. She opened the first one, a birthday card simple with a drawing of a candle on the front. Inside, in that same careful hand, "Happy 5th birthday, my Eleanor. I sent this to your mother's new address in Pennsylvania. I hope it gets to you this time. I think about you every day. I hope you are growing tall and strong. I love you, sweetheart. Your father, Thomas." Eleanor sat on the bedroom floor with the box between her knees and held the card in both hands. She was 63 years old. She had taught second grade for 31 years. She had raised a daughter. She had buried a husband. And she was just now learning that her father had written her a birthday card when she turned 5. She opened the next one. And the next. 5, 6, 7, 8. Each card a year older. Each message a little longer, a little more desperate in its quiet way. The tone never turned angry. Thomas Wynn did not write like a man who blamed anyone. He wrote like a man who was building something with no guarantee it would ever be seen, laying each word down the way a carpenter lays a board, straight and true and permanent, because the work itself mattered, even if no one was watching. The card for her 10th birthday read, "I don't know if your mother gives you these. I suspect she doesn't. But I keep writing because the day I stop is the day I give up. And I promised myself I wouldn't do that. I built something for you, Eleanor. A place. When you're ready, it will be here." Eleanor set the cards on the bed in a row, 10 years of her father's handwriting, fanning out across the quilt George's mother had sewn. She looked at them for a long time. Then she stood up, went to the hallway closet, and pulled down the small suitcase she hadn't used since George's last trip to the hospital. She packed 2 changes of clothes, her reading glasses, her phone charger, a bottle of ibuprofen, and the stack of birthday cards. She put George's coffee mug in the sink. She looked at it sitting there, brown ring and all, and for the first time in 4 months, she felt something move behind her ribs. Not grief exactly, but the place where grief had been sitting so long, it had gone numb. She locked the front door and got in the car. The drive from Harlan County, Kentucky to Briar Hollow, West Virginia, took 6 hours on roads that narrowed as the mountains rose. The interstate gave way to 2-lane highways, then to county roads with no center line winding through hollows where the trees leaned in from both sides, and the light came through in gold and amber. It was late October. The leaves were turning red and copper and deep yellow, and the mountains looked like they were burning slow. Eleanor stopped once for gas and a bottle of water at a station where the attendant was reading a paperback with the cover torn off. She stood beside the car and stretched her back and watched the light move across a hillside so steep the trees grew at an angle. She'd lived in Kentucky her whole adult life, but this was different, older, quieter. The kind of place where the land had been doing its work long before anyone showed up to name it. She got back in the car and drove the last 2 hours without stopping. Briar Hollow announced itself with a sign that read, Population 573. The sign was wooden, hand-painted, faded to a pale green. The town sat in a narrow valley between two ridges, one main street with a hardware store, a post office built from cinder block, a diner with a chalkboard menu in the window, and a general store with a tin roof that had turned the color of rust. Eleanor parked in front of the lawyer's office, a converted house with a porch and a brass plate beside the door. The door was locked. It was after 5. She stood on the porch and looked at the street. A dog was sleeping on the sidewalk in front of the hardware store. An older man in a canvas jacket was loading feed bags into the back of a truck. Nobody looked at her. She walked to the general store because she didn't know where else to go. The woman behind the counter was small and thin, with white hair cut short and close to her head. Wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with the efficient quickness of someone who had spent decades reaching for things on shelves. She was pricing canned goods with a marker writing directly on the lids. She looked up when the screen door clapped shut. She looked at Eleanor. Her hand stopped moving. The marker hovered above a can of pinto beans. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The woman set the marker down slowly. She took off her glasses and held them in one hand and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not surprise, but something closer to recognition, the way you look at someone you've been expecting for a very long time. "You have his eyes," she said. "Lord, you have Thomas's eyes." Eleanor stood just inside the door, her suitcase still in the car, her father's birthday cards in her purse, 63 years old and standing in a store in a town she'd never visited, being recognized by a woman she'd never met. "I'm Hattie Groves. I was your father's neighbor for 37 years, and his closest friend for every one of them." Hattie came around the counter. She moved carefully the way a 71-year-old moves when her knees have opinions, but her gaze was steady and clear. "He kept your picture on the mantel. You were 4 years old in it, holding a dandelion. He looked at that picture every single morning." Eleanor's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together and held still. Hattie didn't try to hug her. She didn't touch her at all. She just stood there close enough to be present, far enough to give Eleanor room. "Have you eaten anything today?" "I had a granola bar somewhere around Lexington." Hattie went to the back of the store and came out with a brown paper bag. She put a sandwich in it, a bottle of water, an apple, and a package of crackers. She set the bag on the counter. "I can pay for those," Eleanor said. "Thomas already did." Hattie pushed the bag toward her. "He left money at this store every month. Said it was for when you came. I've been putting it aside for 9 years." Eleanor picked up the bag. Her hands were steady, but something inside her was not. "He expected me to come." Hattie leaned against the counter and folded her arms. "He didn't expect it. He believed it. There's a difference. Expecting is hoping something might happen. Believing is building your whole life around the certainty that it will." She paused. "He built that cabin for you, Eleanor. Every board, every nail, every joint, 59 years of building." Eleanor looked at the sandwich in the bag wrapped in wax paper. The kind of ordinary thing that suddenly felt like a hand reaching across decades. What was he like? Hattie's face softened, not into sadness, into something warmer and steadier, the expression of someone remembering a person they loved clearly without flinching. "He was a carpenter. Best one in the county, maybe the best one in the state. Could look at a piece of oak and tell you what it wanted to be. He used to say the wood remembers." Hattie tapped the counter with her knuckle. "He meant it literally. He believed that wood holds on to things, the weather it grew through, the soil it came from, the hands that shaped it. He said if you listen close enough, you can hear it." "The wood remembers," Eleanor repeated. The words felt strange in her mouth, like a phrase from a language she almost knew. After you were gone, after your mother took you, he went through a bad stretch. Couple of years where I didn't see much of him. He stayed in his house, the old one, not the cabin, and he drank and he didn't talk to anyone. I'd bring food to his porch, and half the time it sat there until the raccoons got it. What changed? One morning he showed up here at 6 a.m., shaved, clean shirt, eyes clear. He stood right where you're standing, and he said, I'm going to build her a house, Hattie. I'm going to build it from the oak grove where she used to play. And when she comes, the wood will remember her, even if she doesn't remember it. Hattie took her glasses off and cleaned them on the hem of her flannel shirt. I thought he was crazy. Nobody builds a house for a child they might never see again. But Thomas didn't think in terms of might. He thought in terms of will. He cut the first tree that winter. White oak, 200 years old, straight as a sermon. He milled every board himself. The store was quiet. Late afternoon light came through the front window and turned the dust in the air into something gold and slow. He worked on that cabin every day for 59 years. Not all day every day, but some part of every day. Sanding, fitting, carving. He said the work was how he talked to you. Every joint was a sentence. Every room was a letter. Eleanor gripped the paper bag and felt the wax paper crinkle under her fingers. The lawyer said there's a key. There is. Hattie reached under the counter and brought out a small brass key, heavy and warm-colored, with a bow shaped like an oak leaf. Franklin was holding the official copy, but Thomas gave me a spare 20 years ago. Said I'd know when to use it. Eleanor took the key. It was heavier than she expected, solid in her palm. She closed her fingers around it and felt the edges press into her skin. 2 miles up Old Creek Road, Hattie said. Take the left fork where the road splits. You'll see the mailbox. He never put a name on it. Why not? He said the person it was for would know. Eleanor drove with the key in her lap and the paper bag on the passenger seat. The road went from blacktop to gravel to dirt, climbing gently through forests so thick the late sun only reached the ground in narrow shafts. The trees were massive oak and hickory and sycamore, their leaves blazing in the last of the afternoon light. The cabin sat at the end of the road in a clearing bordered by white oaks so tall their canopy formed a ceiling overhead. It was small, one-story with a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney rising from the back wall. The roof was tin-weathered to a soft gray. The porch railing was hand-turned, each spindle slightly different from the last, shaped by hand rather than machine. But it was the door frame that stopped her. Carved into the header above the door was a pattern of oak leaves and acorns, so detailed she could see the veins in each leaf. The work must have taken weeks, maybe months. The wood was dark with age, but the lines were still sharp, each cut deliberate, made by someone who understood that this doorway would be the first thing his daughter touched when she finally came home. Eleanor stood on the porch holding the brass key and looked at the carved leaves above her head. She ran her fingers along one of them. The grain was smooth under her touch, polished by rain and wind and 59 years of waiting. She put the key in the lock. It turned without resistance. The door swung open on oiled hinges, silent, the way a well-built door should move. The cabin smelled like cedar and thyme. A small living room with a stone fireplace. A kitchen with a window over the sink that faced the oak grove. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom. Everything built from the same warm-toned wood, honey-colored, sanded smooth, fitted with a precision that made every surface feel like it had grown into place rather than been cut to fit. Every shelf was level. Every drawer slid without sound. The floorboards didn't creak. This was not a house that had been constructed. It was a house that had been composed, each piece chosen and placed with the kind of attention most people reserve for the things they love most in the world. Eleanor set her purse on the kitchen counter. She walked through each room, slowly trailing her hand along the walls the way you touch something you're afraid might disappear if you stop. In the living room beside the fireplace sat 2 chairs, oak, hand-carved. One was large, wide in the seat, with armrests worn smooth from decades of use. The other was smaller, a child's size. It had never been sat in. The seat was dustless but untouched, waiting with a patience that Wood is particularly good at. Eleanor looked at the small chair for a long time. She sat down in the larger chair first. Then she stood and moved to the smaller one. It held her weight. It didn't creak. The proportions were wrong. Her knees came up too high, and her elbows hung past the armrests, but the chair was solid. It was built for a 4-year-old girl who never came back, and it had waited 60 years without complaint. She leaned back. The wood was cool against her spine. Through the front window, she could see the porch, the oak grove, the dirt road leading away through the trees. This was the view Thomas had looked at every day. This was what he saw when he sat in his chair each evening and watched the road and waited. She ate the sandwich Hattie had packed, sitting in the child's chair, because she couldn't bring herself to move. The bread was fresh, the cheese sharp, the apple crisp. She ate slowly, tasting each bite the way you taste things when your body is tired and your mind is very full, and the quiet around you is so complete it feels like a sound of its own. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. The water ran brown for 10 seconds, then clear. She dried her hands on her jacket and stood at the window looking at the oak grove in the last of the daylight. Then she noticed the baseboard, the one running along the wall near the fireplace just below the mantel. It was the same wood as everything else, the same finish, the same careful fit. But it sat differently. Every other baseboard in the cabin pressed flush against the wall, seamless, tight enough to slip a piece of paper behind. This one had a gap, not from settling or warping. The gap was uniform, exactly the same width, all the way across, machined with a precision that was invisible until you knelt down and looked. Eleanor set the apple core on the mantel. She got on her knees slowly, the way a 63-year-old gets on her knees when her back has been complaining since Lexington, and she pressed one end of the baseboard. Nothing. She pressed the other end. It slid sideways on hidden tracks, smooth and silent, disappearing into the wall, as if the wall had been waiting to open. Behind it was a compartment lined with cedar about 8 inches deep and 2 feet wide. Inside were 5 sealed envelopes, white, each one labeled in the same steady handwriting she'd seen on the birthday cards in her purse. Eleanor, age 5. Eleanor, age 6. Eleanor, age 7. Eleanor, age 8. Eleanor, age 9. She picked up the first envelope. Her fingers trembled against the paper. She slid her thumb under the seal. A birthday card. Simple. A drawing of a single candle on the front, hand-sketched in colored pencil. She opened it. Happy birthday, my Eleanor. You are 5 today. I drove to your mother's house in Pennsylvania last week and parked across the street. I sat in the truck for 2 hours. I could see the swing set in the backyard. I wanted to walk up and knock on the door, but the custody order says I cannot. So I sat and I watched and I came home and I made this card for you instead. I'm keeping it here in the cabin because the ones I mail never reach you. One day you'll find this. I believe that. I love you. Sweetheart, Dad. Eleanor sat on the floor of the cabin her father built and pressed the card against her chest with both hands. The room was going gold with the last light through the window. She could hear the oak trees outside shifting in the wind, a sound so old and patient. It seemed to come from the wood itself, from the walls, from the floor, from the chair she'd just been sitting in. She opened the second card. Age 6. The same voice, the same steady hand. I'm still here, Eleanor. I haven't moved. I won't. Age 7. I filed for visitation this year. The judge said no. Your mother's lawyer used the years I was drinking against me. I've been sober for 4 years now, but the past doesn't let go easy. Age 8. I carved something for you today. A little bird out of a scrap of oak from the grove. I put it on your chair. I know you're too old for it now. 8 is practically grown. But I made it anyway because making things for you is how I get through the days. She looked at the small chair across the room. On the seat, pushed against the backrest, was a wooden bird the size of her thumb. Oak, smooth, wings slightly spread as if it were about to lift off the armrest and fly across the room to her. She hadn't noticed it when she sat down. She'd been sitting right next to it. Age 9. The message was longer. Eleanor, you are 9 years old today. I have now been writing you birthday cards for 5 years and hiding them in the walls of this cabin. I don't know if you will ever see them. Your mother has moved twice since I last found her address, and every letter I send comes back unopened. But I keep writing because the alternative is silence, and I made a promise that I would never go silent on you. I promised your mother that once before you were born. I told her whatever happens between us, I will never disappear from Eleanor's life. She's the one who made me disappear. But I am still here. The wood remembers even when people forget. I love you, Dad. Eleanor laid the 5 cards on the floor in a row. 5 years, 5 birthdays, 5 letters hidden in the wall of a cabin by a man who had no reason to believe his daughter would ever find them, and who hid them anyway because the work of loving someone doesn't require an audience. She wound the brass key between her fingers, the one Hattie had given her, the one shaped like an oak leaf. She looked at the compartment she'd slid open, the cedar-lined space behind the baseboard. The tracks were smooth, the fit was precise. This hiding place had been built with the same care as every joint in the cabin, invisible until you knew where to press. She was certain there were more. She stood up, her knees protesting, and began to walk the perimeter of the room, pressing baseboards, knocking softly on walls, running her fingers along every seam. The cabin was small, but it had been built by a man who'd had 59 years to work, and she was beginning to understand how he thought. The light faded. The room went gray, then dark. Eleanor found a lamp on the table beside the fireplace, an old kerosene lamp cleaned and filled. She lit it with a match from a box in the kitchen drawer, the box labeled in Thomas's handwriting. Matches keep dry. The flame steadied, and the cabin filled with a warm, uneven glow that made the wood grain come alive around her every surface, suddenly textured and deep as if the walls were breathing. She sat in Thomas's chair, the large one with the 5 birthday cards in her lap, and the brass key in her hand, and the kerosene lamp casting her shadow long across the floor. Through the open front door, she could see the porch, the 2 chairs side by side in the dark, the oak grove standing black against a sky full of stars she hadn't seen in years. No streetlights, no neighbors, just the trees and the dark and the sound of the creek somewhere below the ridge, steady and unhurried. The oldest sound in the valley. Her father had sat in this chair every evening. He had looked at this same view. He had watched the road and waited for a car that never came. And he had gone inside and written another letter and hidden it in the wall and gotten up the next morning and done it again. 59 years. She closed her fingers around the key, the brass oak leaf pressing into her palm, and held it there until the metal turned warm. She felt something shift behind her ribs, not the locked-shut numbness that had lived there since George died. Something underneath it, something that had been there longer, buried so deep she'd mistaken it for the shape of her own bones. She had been loved. Her whole life, every year of it, she had been loved by someone she never got the chance to know. And the proof was in the walls. The kerosene lamp flickered. The cabin settled around her, the small sounds of old wood adjusting to the cool night air. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could almost hear it underneath the creek and the wind and the slow tick of the cabin cooling a melody, low, off-key. The song she'd been trying to remember for 59 years, the one her father used to sing. The wood remembers. She opened her eyes. She looked at the baseboard. She'd slid open the dark rectangle of the compartment, the empty space where the cards had been. Then she looked at the rest of the cabin, the kitchen, the bedroom, the walls she hadn't searched yet. There were more letters in this house, more years, more of her father's voice, patient and steady, hidden in the bones of a place he had built one board at a time for a daughter who was finally here. She would find them in the morning. She woke before dawn with her neck stiff and her left hip aching from the chair. The kerosene lamp had burned down to a blue thread of flame. She sat still for a moment, letting the cabin come back to her in pieces, the smell of cedar, the faint cold at the window, the 5 birthday cards still in her lap. She stood, her knees cracked twice. She folded the cards into their envelopes and set them on the mantel beside the wooden bird, then went to the kitchen and tried the faucet. Cold water, clear. She splashed her face and dried it on her sleeve and drank from her cupped hands until her throat stopped feeling like sandpaper. Then she went looking for the rest. The kitchen first. She opened every cabinet, ran her fingers along the backs of shelves, pulled drawers out, and checked behind them. Thomas had been a carpenter for 60 years. He knew how to make seams vanish. The panel under the sink was a single piece of oak, same grain as every other surface. She almost passed it. But when she pressed along the bottom edge, she felt give. Not much. A quarter-inch of movement. She pressed harder, and the panel tilted forward on a hidden hinge, swinging down to reveal a space behind the plumbing. Inside were 10 envelopes ages 10 through 19, each one thicker than the last. And behind them, pushed flat against the back of the compartment, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and opened the birthday cards in order. The messages grew longer as Eleanor aged. Thomas wrote about the weather, about the oak grove, about a fox that had started visiting the porch at dusk. He wrote about the cabin's progress, how the fireplace took 2 summers to finish because the right stone was hard to find. He described rooms she was sitting in now, written when they were still raw framing and exposed joists. The card for her 15th birthday. I imagine you are tall now. May says tall girls have a hard time in school because the boys haven't caught up yet. I wouldn't know about that. I just hope someone is telling you that being tall is a fine thing. Eleanor was 5'9". She had been the tallest girl in her class from 6th grade through graduation. Nobody had told her it was a fine thing. The card for her 18th birthday. You are a woman today, Eleanor. I have been writing you cards for 14 years. I don't know if you know I exist. I don't know what your mother has told you, but I want you to know that on the day you were born, I held you in the delivery room, and you grabbed my finger and would not let go. The nurse had to pry your hand open. You were that strong from the very first minute. She set that card down carefully as if the paper might bruise. The bundle of letters was different, not birthday cards. These were written to Vivian, 1 per year for 15 years, each addressed to whatever house her mother was living in at the time. Every single one had been returned. Some were stamped, returned to sender in red ink. Others were unmarked but still sealed, the kind that gets shoved back in the mailbox with the flag up, and a message that doesn't need words. She opened the first. Vivian, I have been sober for 3 years. I am asking you to let me see my daughter. I will drive to wherever you are. I will meet in a restaurant, a park, a police station. Name the place. She is my child too. The 6th letter. Vivian, I hired a lawyer. He filed for visitation. Your lawyer responded with a list of things I did during the years I was drinking. Most of them are true, but I'm not that man anymore. A person has to be allowed to become someone different, or what is the point of trying? The 12th. I have stopped going to court. I can't afford it and it doesn't work. But I need you to know something. I will never stop. I'm building something for Eleanor. When she is old enough to ask questions, the answers will be here. Eleanor folded the last letter along its creases and slid it back into the envelope. She looked at the stack on the kitchen floor. 15 years of a man talking to a closed door. She stood slower than she used to and went to the bedroom. The panel was on the wall opposite the window. Same wood, same finish. She found the catch after 3 minutes of pressing along the trim. A small wooden button recessed into the bottom corner. The panel swung inward. This compartment was deeper. Inside was a single envelope older than the rest. The paper was yellowed and soft. The handwriting on the front was not Thomas's. It was faster, less careful, written in pencil by someone young. It was addressed to Eleanor Marie, age 4. She opened it. My little Eleanor, your mama and I are going to live in different houses now. I want you to know that this is not because of you. You are the best thing that ever happened to either of us, and that will never change. I'm going to build you a place of your own somewhere in the mountains where the oak trees are so big you can hide inside them. It might take me a while, but it will be yours. I love you more than I know how to say, so I will say the only way I know how. I will build it. Your Daddy Thomas. The letter was dated 3 days before Vivian took Eleanor and left. He had known she was going. He had already started planning. Eleanor pressed the letter flat against her chest and closed her eyes. The bedroom was cold. The morning light hadn't reached the window yet. She could hear a bird outside, one bird singing a phrase and waiting and singing it again, as if it expected an answer. She stayed like that for a long time. Around 8 o'clock, she heard tires on gravel. She went to the front door. Hattie's truck was parked behind Eleanor's car, and Hattie was climbing out with a cardboard box and a thermos. "Coffee's hot," Hattie said, coming up the porch steps. "And I brought you eggs, bread, butter, and a jar of blackberry jam that Margaret Ferris put up last summer. She makes the best jam in the county, and she'll tell you so herself." Eleanor took the thermos. Her hands were cold and the metal was warm, and she held it against her palms before she poured. "I found more," she said. "I figured you would." They sat at the kitchen table, a plank of oak on two sawhorses that Thomas had set up as a workspace and never replaced with real furniture. Eleanor spread the letters and cards across the surface. Hattie read some of them, not all. She read slowly, holding each page at arm's length, because she'd left her glasses in the truck. When she finished the letter to 4-year-old Eleanor, she set it down and pressed her thumb and forefinger against the bridge of her nose. "He wrote that the night before your mother left," Hattie said. "He came to my house at midnight. I could see he'd been crying, which was something Thomas did not do. He said Vivian was taking you to her sister's in Pennsylvania in the morning, and he couldn't stop her. The divorce was already filed. She had custody. Why didn't he fight for me?" Hattie looked at her. "He did fight. For 4 years he fought. But he was a carpenter in Appalachia with a drinking history and a wife whose family had money and lawyers. The court gave Vivian full custody. Thomas got visitation every other weekend, but Vivian moved out of state before the first visit. By the time his lawyer tracked her down, she'd moved again. She ran. She ran. And every time Thomas found her, she ran again. He spent everything he had chasing addresses. Then the money was gone, and all he had left was this land and a promise." Hattie picked up her coffee and held it with both hands, the steam rising between them. "So he built." Eleanor spent the morning working on the porch. The railing was loose on the east side. 3 spindles cracked the bottom rail soft with rot where it met the post. She found Thomas's toolbox in the bedroom closet. A heavy wooden box with brass hinges, each tool cleaned and oiled, and arranged in a way that made her chest hurt. A claw hammer, a set of chisels, a hand plane with a blade so sharp it could shave paper, a tape measure worn thin at the 3-foot mark from years of use. She carried the toolbox to the porch and knelt beside the railing and tried to pry the rotted board free with the claw hammer. The nail wouldn't budge. She adjusted her grip, pulled harder. The hammer slipped and she scraped her knuckles against the post. She sat back on her heels and looked at the blood beading on her hand and felt a sudden furious embarrassment. She had taught children to hold pencils for 31 years. She could laminate a bulletin board in 4 minutes flat. She could not remove a nail from a piece of wood. She tried again. The board cracked in half, the rot worse than she'd thought, and the broken piece fell through the porch gap into the dirt below. She stared at it. Hattie was sitting in the truck reading a newspaper. She hadn't offered to help. She hadn't moved. "The wood's telling you it needs to come out in pieces," Hattie said without looking up. "Rot doesn't let go all at once. You have to work around it." Eleanor looked at the remaining section of board. She positioned the hammer differently this time, angling the claw under the nail head instead of pulling straight back. The nail came free with a sound like a small bone cracking. She worked for 2 hours. She removed the 3 cracked spindles and the rotted rail section. She measured the gaps with Thomas's tape measure. She sanded the post where the rot had spread, working the 80 grit paper in long strokes until she hit solid wood underneath. Her back screamed at her. Her hands ached. She sat on the porch step and drank water and looked at the pile of rotted wood she'd pulled free and felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt useful. In the afternoon, she drove into town for lumber. The hardware store was run by a man named Odell, who had forearms like fence posts and a hearing aid in his left ear that he turned off when he didn't feel like listening. He looked at Eleanor's measurements written on the back of a birthday card envelope and nodded. "White oak," he said. "Same as what Thomas used. I've got some in the back that he ordered 2 years ago and never picked up. Paid for it in advance." He paused. "Paid for a lot of things in advance, your father." He carried the lumber to her car and tied it to the roof rack with rope. He didn't charge her. When she tried to pay, he shook his head and turned off his hearing aid. She drove back to the cabin and spent the rest of the afternoon cutting the new boards to length with Thomas's hand saw. The saw was sharp, but she was slow her cuts, wandering the lines not quite straight. She fitted the first spindle into the railing and checked it with the level. Off by a degree. She removed it, shaved the base with the hand plane refitted. Level. 1 spindle. 3 hours of work. The joint was visible where Thomas's joints were invisible, the new wood lighter than the old, the fit good, but not perfect. It was the first thing she had built in her life. She stood back and looked at it. 1 spindle in a porch railing in a cabin in West Virginia. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it was plumb, and it would hold. She ran her hand along the new spindle. The grain was different from the old woodlighter raw, but when she pressed her thumb against it, she could feel the rings underneath the surface, the years the tree had spent growing before it became part of this porch. The wood remembers, Hattie had said. Eleanor was beginning to understand what that meant. Hattie appeared at the end of the road carrying a foil-wrapped plate. "Margaret Farris sent supper," she said. "Meatloaf." She heard Thomas's daughter was here. The whole town knows by now. She set the plate on the porch railing on the section Eleanor hadn't fixed yet. Word moves fast when it has nowhere else to go. They ate on the porch as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The meatloaf was dense and peppery and good. Hattie told stories about Thomas, small ones, the kind that accumulate into a portrait. How he once spent 6 weeks building a bookshelf for the town library and wouldn't accept payment. How he carved a walking stick for every person in Briar Hollow who turned 80, each one different, each one fitted to the owner's hand. How he sat on this porch every evening and waved at the mail truck, and the mail carrier always waved back. Edgar, the mail carrier, he told me once that he asked Thomas what he was waiting for. Hattie said. Thomas told him he was waiting for his daughter. Edgar said, "How long you been waiting?" Thomas said, "Not long enough." Eleanor set her fork down. "He could have come to find me," she said, "when I was an adult, when the custody order didn't matter anymore. He could have driven to Kentucky and knocked on my door." Hattie was quiet for a moment. He thought about it, talked about it every few years. But by then he'd been writing letters for decades and none of them had been answered. He didn't know that Vivian was keeping them from you. He thought you knew about him and didn't want to see him. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. He thought I was choosing not to come. He thought it was possible. And he said if that was the case, he had no right to force himself into your life. He said, if she doesn't want to know me, that's her choice. But I'll keep the door open in case she changes her mind. Eleanor looked at the front door of the cabin standing open to the evening air. She looked at the 2 chairs, the large one and the small one side by side in the lamplight. He kept the door open for 59 years. 2 days later, a truck she didn't recognize pulled up the road and parked. A young man in work boots and a canvas jacket got out and unloaded a stack of cedar planks from the bed. He carried them to the porch, set them down, nodded at Eleanor, and drove away without a word. No note, no name, just wood. The next morning, a jar of honey appeared on the porch railing. The morning after that, a pair of work gloves, women's size, still in the packaging. Then a box of nails. then a hand-drawn map of the property lines with a note that read, "Your father walked these lines every spring. Thought you should have them." The town was building around her the way Thomas had built the cabin one piece at a time without announcement. Eleanor fixed the porch. All of it. It took a week. Her cuts got straighter. Her joints got tighter. She learned to read the grain the way Hattie described, pressing her thumb across the surface and feeling for the direction the wood wanted to go. She still wasn't fast and she still wasn't graceful, and on the third day she hit her thumb with the hammer so hard the nail turned black. But the porch was solid, it was level, it held weight. She was sanding the last post on a Friday afternoon when a sedan came up the road. Dark blue, moving slowly, the kind of car that doesn't belong on a dirt road and knows it. It stopped behind her car, and the engine idled for a moment before it cut off. A man got out. 55, maybe older, gray suit, no tie-polished shoes, already collecting dust from the road. He looked at the cabin the way an appraiser looks at a house, measuring the angles, estimating the worth. He walked up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at the fresh lumber, the new spindles, the sanding dust on the railing. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Wynn," his voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who made his living being reasonable. "My name is Harlan Combs. I represent Ridgeline Timber Associates. I wonder if you have a moment to talk about your property." Eleanor set down the sandpaper. She didn't stand. She stayed on her knees beside the post looking up at him. "What about it?" "Your father's land, 40 acres, sits in the middle of one of the last significant stands of old-growth white oak in this part of the state. Ridgeline has been acquiring parcels in this valley for the past 3 years. We are prepared to offer you $180,000 for the property, cabin included. It's not for sale." Combs smiled, not unkindly. The smile of a man who has heard this before and considers it the opening of a negotiation rather than the end of one. "I understand you've only been here a short while, Mrs. Wynn. It's a beautiful property, but maintaining 40 acres of forest and an aging cabin on a retired teacher's income is a significant undertaking. The offer is generous, well above market value for this area." Eleanor looked past him at the oak grove. The trees her father had cut his lumber from. The trees whose wood was now the walls she slept inside. "My father spent 59 years building this place. He cut the trees himself. He milled the boards. He carved the door frame. Every wall in that cabin is made from this land. You're asking me to sell a man's life work 1 week after I found out he existed." Combs's smile dimmed slightly. He adjusted his cuffs. "The offer stands, Mrs. Wynn. Take some time. But I should mention that the County Road Commission has questions about the access road. Whether it's public or private has never been formally established. If it's ruled public right-of-way, it could complicate your title." He set a business card on the porch railing on the section Eleanor had just sanded smooth. Then he walked back to the sedan and drove away. Eleanor picked up the card. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She looked at the road where the sedan had been and felt the first real fear she'd felt since arriving. Not the dull fear of loneliness or the slow fear of aging, but the sharp, immediate fear of losing something she had only just found. She told Hattie that evening. They were sitting on the porch eating soup from mismatched bowls, the kind of meal that happens when two people have known each other just long enough to skip formality. Hattie listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, Hattie set her bowl on the railing. "Ridgeline's been circling this valley for years. They've bought out 4 families already. Thomas knew they'd come eventually. He told me so." "Did he do anything about it?" "He said he did. He said he'd taken care of the road. But he didn't tell me how or where the paperwork was. Thomas kept important things in the walls, Eleanor. That's where you'll have to look." The cabin had already given her birthday cards, letters, and a lifetime of proof that her father loved her. Now she needed it to give her something else. Something legal. Something that would keep the timber company from cutting down the oaks that were the cabin's bones. She started searching the next morning. But the cabin was small, and she had already opened every compartment she could find: living room baseboard, kitchen sink panel, bedroom wall. She knocked on every surface. She checked the bathroom, the closet, the floorboards. Nothing. 3 days passed. Combs' business card sat on the kitchen counter, the phone number facing up. She didn't call. She didn't know what she would say. On the fourth day, Eleanor's phone rang. A number she didn't recognize, area code from North Carolina. "Grandma?" Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. She had not heard that voice in over 2 years. "Wren, I'm in town, at the gas station on the main road. Mom told her friend you were in West Virginia, and I heard her on the phone." A pause, a breath that shook. "Can I come to the cabin?" Eleanor closed her eyes. She pressed her free hand against the kitchen counter. "Do you know how to get here?" The woman at the gas station said, "Go north on Old Creek Road and take the left fork." "Take the left fork. You'll see the mailbox with no name." 20 minutes later, a car Eleanor didn't recognize pulled up the dirt road, an older model with a cracked windshield and a bumper sticker peeling at one corner. The passenger door opened and Wren got out. 16. Thin. A backpack over one shoulder, the straps gripped tight in both hands. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail so tight it stretched the skin at her temples. She wore a jacket too light for the mountains in October and shoes that had no business on a dirt road. She stood beside the car and looked at the cabin the way a stray animal looks at an open door wanting to come in, ready to bolt. The driver, a woman Eleanor didn't know, leaned across the seat. "I found her walking on Route 19. She said her grandmother was up here." She looked at Eleanor. "She's been walking for a while." Eleanor nodded. The woman drove away. Wren stood in the clearing, backpack in her hands, not moving. Eleanor came down the porch steps. She stopped 3 feet away. She did not close the distance. She did not reach out. She stood where she was and let Wren decide. "Are you hungry?" Wren nodded. "Come inside." She made a sandwich from the bread and cheese Hattie had brought. Wren ate at the kitchen table, the plank on sawhorses, not looking up. Eleanor sat across from her and did not speak. She let the girl eat. She let the cabin be warm. She let the quiet do the work. When Wren finished, she set the sandwich wrapper down and looked at Eleanor for the first time since she'd arrived. Her eyes were red, not from crying, from exhaustion, from whatever had driven her to walk along a highway in a jacket too thin for the weather. "Mom and Kevin had a fight," Wren said. Kevin was Caroline's husband, Wren's stepfather. "A bad one. And then she told me I was just like you, and it wasn't a compliment." Eleanor felt the words land in a place she recognized. A place that had been quiet for a long time but had never fully healed. "How long have you been gone?" 2 days. "Does your mother know where you are?" "No." Eleanor looked at the girl across the table. 16, thin jacket, backpack with everything she owned. A stepfather who didn't want her, and a mother who couldn't hold on to her own hurt without passing it to the next person in line. She saw herself at 63. She saw Thomas at 30 watching Vivian drive away with a 4-year-old in the back seat. She saw the circle, the same wound moving through the family like water through a crack, finding the weakest point in each generation and splitting it open. "You can stay here tonight," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest." That night, Eleanor lay in the bedroom listening to Wren breathing on the couch in the living room. The girl had fallen asleep within minutes, curled under a quilt Hattie had brought 2 days ago, her backpack on the floor beside her, like a life raft she wasn't willing to let go of. Eleanor stared at the ceiling. She thought about Caroline. She thought about the things she hadn't said, the conversations she'd let die, the distance she'd maintained, because distance was easier than mess. She thought about what Caroline had said to Wren. "You're just like your grandmother." She picked up her phone and called her daughter. Caroline answered on the 6th ring. Her voice was flat, the flatness Eleanor recognized because she had taught it to her. "Mom, it's 11 o'clock. "Wren is here." Silence. She showed up at the cabin this afternoon. She walked part of the way. A stranger picked her up on Route 19. Is she okay? She's sleeping. Another silence, longer this time. Eleanor could hear something in the background, a television, or maybe just the sound of a house that was too quiet. She and Kevin had a fight, Caroline said. I tried to talk to her and she locked herself in her room, and by morning she was gone. She said you told her she was just like me. Caroline didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had an edge. Eleanor knew well, the edge of someone who is angry and right, and doesn't want to be either. You were never really there, Mom. You were in the room. You were always in the room. But you were behind glass. I could see you, but I couldn't reach you. Every time I tried to talk about something real, about Dad dying, about being scared, about anything that mattered, you'd change the subject or go quiet or suddenly need to clean something. You taught me that feelings were something to survive, not something to share. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The words hit like the flat side of a board, not sharp, just solid, covering everything at once. I know, she said. You know. I know. I did that. I learned it from my mother, and I passed it on to you, and now you're passing it on to Ren. And I'm sitting in a cabin that my father built because he couldn't reach me either. And I'm looking at 59 years of the same mistake, repeating itself. And I don't know how to stop it, but I know it has to stop. The line was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought Caroline had hung up. Then a breath, unsteady. What cabin? What are you talking about? My father was alive, Caroline. My whole life. He was alive and he built a cabin in West Virginia, and he hid letters in the walls for me. 59 years of letters. My mother kept him from me the same way I kept myself from you, by shutting the door and pretending there was nothing on the other side. She heard Caroline crying, not loudly, the muffled private crying of someone pressing a hand over their mouth. Mom, I need to come see you. Come. I don't know if I can forgive you. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to come. She hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. Through the bedroom door, she could see the living room. The faint shape of Ren on the couch, the birthday cards on the mantel, the two chairs by the fireplace, the large one, the small one. She had spent her whole life sitting behind glass. Her mother had put the glass there, and Eleanor had kept it polished, and Caroline had grown up pressing her face against it. And now Ren was walking along highways because nobody on either side could figure out how to break through. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a truck on the road. Not Hattie's, a heavier engine diesel moving slow. She went to the window. A flatbed truck was parked at the edge of the clearing. Ridgeline Timber Associates painted on the door in green block letters. Two men in hard hats were standing at the tree line with a surveyor's tripod measuring something, marking trees with orange tape. Eleanor walked outside in her stocking feet. The morning was cold frost on the porch boards, her breath visible in the air. This is private property. The taller man looked up from the tripod. Ma'am, we're surveying the county road right of way. The access road is under review. We have authorization from the county clerk. The road is private. My father owned it. That's what's being determined, ma'am. If you have documentation of private ownership, you can present it at the county hearing. It's been scheduled for 10 days from now. The men went back to their work. Eleanor stood on the porch in the cold, watching them tie orange tape around oaks that were older than anyone alive. She went inside. Ren was sitting up on the couch, the quilt pulled around her shoulders. Who are they? People who want to take the trees. Eleanor looked at the cabin walls, the honey-colored oak, the hand-carved trim, the hidden compartments she'd opened, and the ones she hadn't found. Somewhere in this house was proof that the road belonged to Thomas. He had told Hattie he'd taken care of it. He had hidden it the way he hid everything in the bones of the place, waiting to be found by someone who cared enough to look. She had 9 days. She walked to the fireplace and knelt on the stone hearth, her knees protesting, her hands flat against the cold rock. She pressed each stone. She knocked. She listened. Nothing moved. Wren appeared beside her, still wrapped in the quilt. "What are you looking for?" "Something your great-grandfather hid. I don't know where." Wren knelt beside her. She didn't ask why. She just started pressing stones. They searched for 3 hours. Hearth, mantel, chimney base, floorboards near the fireplace. Nothing. Eleanor sat back against the wall, breathing hard, her hands dusty and her back a long continuous ache. The cabin had given her everything else. The letters, the cards, the proof of love. But the one thing she needed to keep it all, the legal claim to the road. The document that would stop the timber company from cutting down the trees her father had spent his life among was still hidden. 9 days, and her father, the only one who knew where it was, had been dead for 10 months. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark listening to Wren breathe on the couch and the surveyor's truck drip oil onto the gravel where it had idled that morning. 8 days now. She turned the brass key over and over in her fingers, the oak leaf bow catching the faint moonlight through the window, and she thought about Thomas. Not the letters, not the birthday cards. She thought about the way he built. Hattie had told her Thomas believed the wood remembered, that every board carried the history of what it had been before it was cut. The weather, the soil, the years of growth and stillness. He didn't fight the material. He listened to it. He put the most important things in the places that made sense to the wood, not to him. The baseboards held the earliest letters because baseboards are the first thing a carpenter installs when finishing a room. The kitchen panel held the middle years because the kitchen is where you do your daily work. The bedroom held the oldest letter, the 1 to 4-year-old Eleanor, because the bedroom is where you keep the things closest to your heart. Each hiding place followed the logic of the house itself. She sat up in the dark. The most important thing. The document that protected the land, the road, the trees, everything. Thomas would have hidden it last. He would have put it in the place a carpenter considers the most permanent, the most protected, the hardest to reach, and the hardest to destroy. The baseboards could be pried up. The kitchen panel could be kicked in. The bedroom wall could be opened with a finger. But the fireplace was stone mortar and gravity. It was the spine of the cabin. Everything else was built around it. She had searched the hearth. She had pressed every stone she could reach. But she had been thinking like a schoolteacher, systematic and horizontal, working along the surface. Thomas thought like a carpenter. He thought vertically. She got up. She lit the kerosene lamp and carried it to the fireplace. She didn't look at the hearth. She looked up. The mantel was a single plank of white oak 8 inches deep fitted into the stone wall on both sides. She had set the birthday cards on it. She had set the wooden bird on it. She had looked at it every day for 2 weeks and never thought to look inside it. She reached up and ran her fingers along the underside. Smooth. She pressed. Solid. She moved her hand to the left edge where the wood met the stone and felt along the joint. Tight. Seamless. She moved to the right edge. There. A ridge. Not a flaw. A seam so fine it was invisible from below, running along the bottom face of the mantel about 2 inches from the right side. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed and pushed to the left. A section of the mantel's underside slid sideways on tracks she couldn't see, revealing a slot cut into the body of the plank no wider than an envelope. She reached in. Her fingers touched paper. She pulled it out. A manila envelope, thin, sealed with a brass clasp. She opened it under the lamplight. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a deed of easement dated 31 years ago, signed by Thomas Edward Wynn and filed with the county clerk of Briar Hollow. It granted permanent private access along the road from the county line to the cabin property, with the road classified as a private right-of-way owned by the landowner. The filing stamps were clear. The notary seal was intact. The second document was a letter from a surveyor, dated 6 months after the easement, confirming that the access road fell entirely within the boundaries of Thomas's property and had never been part of the county road system. Thomas had taken care of it. 31 years ago, he had walked into the county clerk's office and filed the paperwork that would protect the road, the land, and the cabin from anyone who came after it. Then he had hidden the proof in the one place no one would think to look. The last place, the deepest place, the mantle he had carved with his own hands. Eleanor gripped the documents with both hands and let her breath out slowly, a long exhale that carried the weight of 8 days of searching. But there was something else in the slot. Her fingers touched wood. She reached deeper and pulled out a small box, dark oak no bigger than a deck of cards, with a brass clasp identical to the one on the key Hattie had given her. She opened it. A music box. The mechanism was tiny, a metal comb and cylinder fitted into a hollowed space with a precision that made her eyes sting. She turned the small brass winding key on the side. The melody was slow, simple. A lullaby played on metal teeth, each note clean and deliberate, filling the cabin with a sound so fragile it seemed to exist only in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She knew it, not from memory, from somewhere deeper, from the place where a 4-year-old girl sat on a workbench while her father sang off-key the melody she had carried in her body for 59 years without knowing what it was. On the inside of the lid, burned into the wood in letters no bigger than a thumbnail, "The wood remembers." And beneath the music box, folded once pressed flat by the weight of 3 decades, was the last letter. The handwriting was shaky, the lines wandered. Thomas had written this one near the end, his hand unsteady, but his words precise. "Dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then you found the cabin and you found what I left for you. I hope you found it in order. The baseboards first, then the kitchen, then the bedroom, then the mantel. That's how I built them. One hiding place for each season of your life I missed. I want to explain why I hid everything in the walls instead of leaving it with a lawyer or a bank. The answer is simple. Your mother could contest a will. She could close a bank account. She could intercept a letter. But she could not reach inside the walls of a house she didn't know existed and take what I built with my own hands. I also want to tell you something I never put in the birthday cards. I knew your mother was leaving before she left. I came home from work and the closets were half empty and the suitcases were by the door. You were asleep on the couch in your yellow overalls, the ones with the daisy on the pocket. I sat beside you and watched you breathe for an hour. I knew that when you woke up, you would be gone. I could have taken you. I could have put you in the truck and driven north and hidden us both in these mountains. I thought about it. I sat beside you and I thought about it for the entire hour. But I didn't. Because taking a child from her mother is not something I could build a life around, no matter how wrong that mother was. A man who starts by stealing, even stealing something that belongs to him, builds everything after that on a broken foundation. I know this because I am a carpenter, and I know what happens to a house built on a crack. So I let you go, and I built you a place to come back to. 59 years is a long time to wait, Eleanor. Some days I wasn't sure you'd come. Some days I was sure you wouldn't. But I built anyway because the building was how I held on to you. Every nail was a day I didn't give up. Every joint was a promise I kept. The cabin is not a house. It is the shape of how much I loved you when I couldn't say it any other way. You have my hands, Eleanor. I know that even though I haven't seen them since you were 4. You have the hands of a builder. Whatever is broken, you can fix it. Whatever is missing, you can make it. Whatever has been taken from you, you can build it back. I love you. I loved you the morning you were born and the night your mother drove away, and every day between then and now. I love you in the walls of this cabin, and in the wood of these trees, and in the melody of this music box, which I made from the same oak that grew outside your window when you were a baby. The wood remembers Eleanor, and so do I, your father Thomas. Eleanor sat on the hearth with the letter in her lap, and the music box playing its slow lullaby, and she wept. Not the locked-shut silence of the past 4 months, not the rigid composure of a woman who had spent her life behind glass. She wept the way the cabin walls held sound fully openly without resistance, letting it fill every corner and every seam. Wren appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak. She crossed the room and sat beside Eleanor on the cold stone and leaned her shoulder against her grandmother's arm. The quilt was still around her shoulders, and she opened one side of it and draped it over Eleanor without asking. They sat like that while the music box wound down. The cabin was quiet. The kerosene lamp burned steady. Outside, the oak stood black against a sky that was just beginning to lighten at the eastern ridge. In the morning, Eleanor drove into town. She walked into Franklin Jessup's office and set the deed of easement and the surveyor's letter on his desk. Franklin read them twice, turning each page, slowly running his thumb along the filing stamps. Then he leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks. This is filed and recorded. It's binding. The road is private. Ridgeline has no claim to access through your property. Can they still cut the trees on the adjacent parcels? They can cut what they own, but they can't get heavy equipment to those parcels without crossing your road, and your road is private. Without access, the timber isn't worth harvesting. The cost of building a new road would exceed the value of the lumber. Eleanor gathered the documents. She stood in the doorway of the lawyer's office and looked at the main street of Briar Hollow, the hardware store, the diner, the general store with its tin roof. The same view Thomas had seen every time he came to update his will. Franklin, did my father ever talk about me? Franklin took off his glasses and set them on the desk. Every year, Mrs. Wynn, every single year. He'd come in, sign the papers, and ask the same question. Has she written back yet? He paused. I didn't know what it meant until you showed up. She called Harlan Combs that afternoon from the porch. She kept her voice level. She read him the filing number of the deed of easement, and the date it was recorded, and the name of the county clerk who had stamped it. Combs was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he thanked her for her time and hung up. The orange tape came down from the trees the next day. Nobody came to remove it. It just disappeared overnight, as if the forest had taken it back. Caroline arrived on a Saturday. She drove up from Charlotte in a car packed with things she hadn't explained on the phone: a sleeping bag, a cooler, a box of books. She stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin for a long time before she walked to the porch. Eleanor was sitting in Thomas's chair. Wren was on the steps whittling a stick with a pocket knife Hattie had given her. Caroline climbed the steps. She looked at the carved oak leaves above the door. She touched them the way Eleanor had touched them 2 weeks ago, fingertips tracing the veins, reading the surface the way you read Braille. She looked at Eleanor. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set to the jaw of a woman who had driven 6 hours to do something hard. Show me, she said. Eleanor took her inside. She showed her the baseboards, the kitchen panel, the bedroom wall, the mantel. She laid out the birthday cards in order on the kitchen table, 10 across, 5 down, 59 years of her father's handwriting, covering the plank of oak. She showed her the letters to Vivian. She showed her the letter Thomas had written to 4-year-old Eleanor the night before Vivian drove away. Caroline read the letters standing up the way a person reads when they're not sure their legs will hold if they sit down. When she reached Thomas's final letter, the one from the mantel, her hand rose to her mouth. She read it twice. She set it on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood, the same gesture Eleanor had made in her own kitchen the day the lawyer's letter arrived. Mom? Her voice cracked on the single syllable. He waited his whole life. He did, and you didn't know. I didn't know. Caroline looked at the 2 chairs by the fireplace. The larger one, the small one. She looked at Eleanor and something shifted in her face. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a thing that arrives all at once, but recognition. The recognition of a pattern seen clearly for the first time. The same wound passing from Vivian to Thomas to Eleanor to Caroline to Wren, a crack in the foundation running through 4 generations, and the sudden understanding that someone had to be the one to stop it. Eleanor wound the music box. The lullaby filled the cabin, thin and steady, each note a point of light in the quiet room. I'm sorry, Eleanor said, for every door I closed, for every time you reached for me and I wasn't there. I learned it from my mother, and I did it to you, and I don't have an excuse. I just have this. She held up the brass key, the one with the oak leaf bow. She set it on the table between them. The door is open, Caroline. It has been open since the day you were born. I just didn't know how to say so. Caroline picked up the key. She held it in her palm the way Eleanor had held it in Hattie's store, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of the brass, the shape of the leaf pressed into her skin. She closed her fingers around it and held on. That afternoon, Eleanor walked to Odell's hardware store and bought lumber. White oak. She carried it to the cabin in the back of Hattie's truck and spent the evening measuring and cutting by hand using Thomas's saw. Thomas's chisels, Thomas's level. She built a third chair. It took 2 days. The joints were tighter than her first work, but still visible. The seat was slightly wider than the child's chair, slightly narrower than Thomas's. She sanded it with 120 grit until the grain shone. She didn't stain it. She left the wood bare, new and pale beside the darkened oak of the other two. On a Sunday evening in early November, 3 chairs sat on the porch of the cabin Thomas Wynn had built. Eleanor sat in the large one. Caroline sat in the one Eleanor had made. Wren sat in the small one, her legs folded under her because she was 16 and could still fold that way, the wooden bird from the mantel resting in her palm. The music box was on the railing, wound and playing. The lullaby drifted across the porch and into the oak grove and out over the ridge, where the last light was turning the sky from copper to violet, to the deep bruised blue that comes just before the stars. The air smelled like cold oak leaves and wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of the blackberry jam still on the counter inside. Eleanor could hear the creek below the ridge steady and unhurried. She could hear the music box winding down, each note slower than the last, stretching the spaces between them until the silence felt like part of the song. She looked at the door frame above her head, the carved leaves and acorns, the work of a man who had spent 59 years saying the only thing he knew how to say. She looked at the brass key hanging from a nail beside the door, where she had placed it that morning, where anyone who came to this cabin could see it. The door was open. The porch light was on. The chairs were waiting. 3 women, 3 generations sitting in the house a man had built because he could not say I love you any other way. The wood was warm under their hands. The trees stood tall around them, the same oaks Thomas had cut his lumber from, still growing, still remembering. The music box played its last note. The sound hung in the cold air for a long moment, then faded. The cabin settled into the evening the way old houses do, with small sounds, gentle shifts, the quiet breathing of wood that has held its shape for decades and intends to hold it for decades more. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could feel the grain of the armrest under her fingertips, smooth and steady, each ring a year of growth. Each year a record of weather and patience, and the slow, stubborn work of becoming what the soil and the rain and the light intended. The wood remembers, and so finally did she. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear from you. If you had one more day with someone you lost, what would you say to them? Tell me in the comments, and if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one waiting for you here. Thank you for listening. Sleep well tonight.